Will you pray with me? Holy One, may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, because you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So there's something about seeing in these stories, right? These stories of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. The Bible study's looking at them. You can hear more about the story we just read today after the service. And they will tell you, those people who are thinking hard like I am about these stories, that there's something about seeing in them. The story we read on Easter Sunday starts with Mary coming to the tomb and finding it empty, and she goes and gets two other guys, and they look in, and it says that they see and they believe and they do not understand what is happening. And then right after that, Mary sits outside the tomb weeping, right? And you remember someone comes up to her and says, "Mary, why are you weeping?" And it's Jesus, and she looks right at him and doesn't recognize him. And tells him what's wrong, and it's only when he says Mary that she suddenly recognizes him. The veil that has been before her eyes is pulled away, and she can see him, perceive him standing in front of her. And this theme goes on and on and on. Today in the story, these two guys are walking on their way to Emmaus, and there's Jesus right next to them for that whole long way, all those miles. And you might say, well, maybe they didn't actually know Jesus. Maybe they'd never met him. Apparently, everyone in Jerusalem, they say, have heard about what's going on. Maybe they were just people who heard about it, heard the story, and were walking along. That could be. Tradition holds, however, that the guy who's named Cleopas is actually Jesus' uncle. There's another person with a similar name elsewhere in the Bible whose wife, Mary, another Mary, is standing at the foot of the cross. And because of this connection and the way that the people who are gathered at the foot of the cross that day are described, tradition has come to believe, who knows, that this guy, Cleopas, is his uncle. And still today, official doctrine of many churches say that. So we assume that he would know what Jesus looks like, just as well as you would know what your nephew looked like should he come up to you on the side of the road. So they walk all this way and they see him. They know he's there. The information is getting through their eyeballs and into their brains, but they can't perceive it. There are other stories like that where Jesus shows up in the midst of the disciples and says, "Peace be with you," right? There could not possibly be a Jesus-ier thing to do than to show up and say, "Peace be with you," when no one expects it, right? But it says that it's only when they see the wounds that he bears that they recognize him. Not his face, not seeing his face, not hearing his voice. It's only when they see the wounds. Over and over and over, this theme of there being some kind of veil before the people's eyes, and they can see what's in front of them, but they can't process it. Their brains can't get there. And in today's story, it goes further even than the other ones. It says that they were kept from recognizing him. By whom, or what, or how, we do not know. Was it God? Did God want to make a point? Did God keep them from recognizing him? Was it the narrator? Was the guy that's writing the story trying to build tension, and so the narrator keeps them from recognizing him? Was it Jesus himself? Was it something in them? Their grief, or their confusion, their exhaustion, or the hunger that they felt? Maybe it was just a really windy day and they were squinting. We don't know. And of course, that's the point of telling the story this way. You're supposed to insert yourself into it. You're supposed to ask yourself, if I were there on the road that day, what would keep me from recognizing Jesus if he were right there? Just the way you should be asking yourself right now, if I were sitting in church at about 10:20 on a Sunday morning and Jesus was sitting right next to me, what would keep me from recognizing him? What might be keeping me from recognizing him right now? That's why they don't go into the mechanics of it. You're supposed to ask yourself that, but if you don't want to ask yourself that, fear not, I have an answer. Or at least a potential answer. I think it has to do with the color blue. People who study language have taken time, believe it or not, had the time on their hands to take time to figure out when different color names entered different languages and in what order and why. It all started in the mid-1800s when some guy noticed that in the Odyssey, Homer famously talks about the wine-dark sea. And whoever it was that was reading this was like, wine dark? That doesn't make any sense. Was it purple? Was it black? Wine's not blue. Water's blue. He didn't stop to remind himself that Homer's traditionally understood to be blind. So maybe, that Homer could be forgiven for not knowing what the sea actually looks like. But on the other hand, it got him really thinking, and he read the whole thing and found out that not once is the color blue mentioned in that entire epic. And then he counted up all the other color references, and it turns out everybody else is mentioned, all the other colors are there, but blue, not at all. And so he wondered, maybe ancient people couldn't see the color blue. This is the theory he put forth, and people wrestled with that for a while, and they looked in lots of ancient literature, and they found out that actually blue is mentioned very, very rarely in ancient literature. And so they decided that it must be our eyes are different nowadays. We can see blue now, but they actually couldn't see blue then. They were blue colorblind. Time advanced a little bit, and others started looking at this, and they realized that almost definitely could not be. That's such a small time frame, evolutionarily speaking, those few thousand years for us to have evolved a new color-seeing ability. So probably people's eyes worked the same in ancient times as they do now. Probably the blue information was getting to their eyeballs and to their brains just like it does for us. It's unlikely our bodies could have changed that much. But it is possible they didn't have a way to talk about it. At the end of the 1800s, this guy named Lazarus Geiger, it's so great that his name was Lazarus when we're talking about resurrection. It's like one of those gifts that God gives preachers. His name is Lazarus Geiger. He's a philologist, and he's interested in the way that the words we use, the language we have, influences the way we perceive the world. And so he starts looking at this question of colors, and he looks at all these ancient languages, Chinese, Japanese, Hebrew, Greek, and others. Now you'll just notice all these languages are from around the Mediterranean, Europe, Asia. He did not look at ancient languages in the Americas. Who knows? If he did, maybe it would blow all of this out of the water. But the ancient languages that he looked at, he found out that there was a definite and consistent pattern to the emergence of color names in every one of those languages. In every one of those languages, the first color names they have are black and white, or light and dark. That kind of makes sense. That's sort of a basic human experience, right? Day and night, light and dark. Next comes red in every one of them. This is years and years later down the development of the language. Next comes green and yellow, and then there's a long, long pause. A long pause. Years and years and years and years and years. Entire civilizations rise and fall, and then blue emerges as a color name. And his thinking is that actually blue is very rare in nature. In most places in nature, the only blue thing is the sky. And if you only see one thing that's a given color, you don't need a color to describe it. You just say sky. There are very few blue flowers, even fewer blue fruits. There are a couple of blue birds if you happen to live in the right part of the world, but very few in the parts of the world where these languages developed. They didn't need a name for that color because they never saw it, or very rarely. And when they did, there was only one thing, and then maybe the water too if they happened to live near a big enough body. The first ancient culture that this guy could find that developed a name for the color blue was the ancient Egyptians. And do you know what they were also one of the very first cultures to do? Create blue dye. It's very hard to make blue pigments from natural sources. Indigo will do it if you happen to live in a place where indigo exists. A plant called woad will do it if you live in northwestern Europe. And that's about it. There are some semi-precious metals, if you happen to get lucky, that you can grind up and turn into paint. It's really hard to do and very expensive. So most cultures had no blue pigments or paints until their civilizations evolved pretty far along. And the Egyptians were one of the first ones, and suddenly they were able to shape their own environment with the color blue. They could insert it into their lives in ways that nature hadn't done it for them. And suddenly, when that started happening, they needed a word for it, right? And as soon as they created a word for it, they started seeing it in more and more and more places. And this pattern seems to have repeated itself in every one of these cultures that this guy looked at. It needed to exist before they named it, and as soon as they named it, it seemed that they could see it everywhere. They started needing more and more and more words, not just blue, but different shades of blue, different ways to describe different kinds of blue. It's like when you trade in your old junker, right, and you buy a Prius, and suddenly everyone around you, everyone on the road is driving a Prius, right? As soon as you open your eyes to it, you see it everywhere. As soon as you care enough about it to notice it, you see it every place you go, and you develop language for it. If you're an early modern culture, that is. And I think that's what's going on in these stories too. Jesus is right there in front of them. They can see him just as clearly as a pre-modern person could see the color blue, but they had no way to name what was going on. And without a way to name what was going on, they couldn't see what was right in front of them until somebody hit them over the head with it. And then as soon as someone hit them over the head with it and they couldn't ignore what was in front of them anymore, they started talking about it. In every one of these stories, the next thing after the people meet Jesus, the next thing they do is they go out and they start telling people about it. They start developing words for it, creating language to name it, ways to express the idea to other people so that they can begin to see it out there in the world. And I think that's the veil that was in front of their eyes. They had never seen it before. It was so new, there weren't even words to describe it. On Easter, I said that one of the things that drives us nuts about the resurrection story is that there is no inherent ethical demand attached to the resurrection. There's stuff that we can pull out of it later on, but just the guy rising from the dead doesn't inherently demand anything from you, right? Except, Jesus said, tell people what you've seen and do not be afraid. So it's that tell people what you've seen. That's the demand that comes with experiencing the risen Christ in your midst. Tell people what you've seen. Develop language for it. Create words to name it. And the more you do that, the more you will see it around you. And the more you can get other people to use that same language, the more they will see it too. And so if you wish to meet God, if you long to meet the risen Christ in your midst the way these guys did on the road to Emmaus, that will be the trick, friends. When you get a sense that God may be alive in front of you, you have to name it. Create language for it and tell it. When you're in your garden at 5:30 a.m. and the peace of the ages comes over you, you can choose to just say, man, it sure is nice out here. Or you could say, maybe this is the Spirit of the risen Christ falling afresh on me. You're going to get to choose how you name it. But if what you long for is Jesus, you name it Jesus. And the more you do that, the more you will see it wherever that power comes over you at midnight, with your lover, on Sunday morning, in church, in the middle of the day, while breastfeeding your infant, at your parents' graves, wherever it is that you feel that power and that peace and that beauty come over you, you can choose to let the veil stay there, or you can name it for what you hope it is and for what it might be. And the more you do that, the better you'll get at it. The more precise language you'll have for it. Suddenly you won't just be saying blue. If you do it often enough, every time it comes over you, you won't just say blue. You'll know the difference between ultramarine and cerulean. You'll know the difference between baby and navy and midnight. You will be able to describe what Mary's robe looks like in the Middle Ages and what stained glass windows in cathedrals look like. You will have so many words for the name blue, they will write books about it. If that's what you long for, all you have to do is name it when you see it. Amen.